The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Every good detective is well acquainted with the saying, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned." In many investigations, the ex-wives and ex-girlfriends are typically a gold mine of telling information on a suspect. His ex-wife had delivered a bombshell about his deviant acts in their sex life and his confession of murdering and chopping up a young girl when he was living in an apartment hosted by the Mennonite church. I took a big drink from my simple black coffee and plugged my headphones into my laptop. I grabbed my steno pad and I wrote ex-girlfriends across the top and hit the play button on the file. From Chasing Down the Zombie Hunter by Troy A. Hillman. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is part 3, episode 150, Still Room in Hell, 2ndCast, on Troy A. Hillman's Chasing Down the Zombie Hunter. As always, please listen to part 1 and 2 before listening further, because it's going to make a whole lot more sense. And please tell me that you are keeping warm. Snow, ice storms, hail. It's perfect for a cold case book. Yeah, I went there, I know. That's terrible. Well, after decades as a cold case, after years of frustration and perseverance by the Phoenix Department's Cold Case Unit, finally, the DNA collected from the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas matched a suspect, with elation from the unit put together by our author, Troy Hillman. William Shira, Marianne Ramirez, J.J. Alberta, Clark Schwarzkopf, Dominic Rostenberg, Mark Armistead, and DNA expert Kelly Merwin got this guy, the zombie hunter himself, Bryan Patrick Miller. In custody, they began piecing together who this guy is and if there are other victims that they can attribute to him. Because when the arrest is made, the work continues for a long, long time. So, who is Bryan Patrick Miller? The Arizona Republic article by Megan Cassidy gave us a lot of insight. He was born on October 24th, 1972, to his 18-year-old mother, Martha Ellen James, and his father, Lester Paul Miller. Ellen and Paul, as they were known, married after discovering the unplanned pregnancy. Initially, they lived with Paul's parents before moving to Hawaii, where he was stationed in the military. When Bryan was 5 years old on December 15, 1977, his father tragically died in a motorcycle accident. And this event marks the beginning of Bryan's recollection of abuse by his mother, Ellen. People who knew Ellen described her as intensely angry and two-faced. Under oath, a former neighbor said Ellen was, quote, a bitch, end quote. Mother and son lived in Greater Kaneohe, a short drive from Honolulu, in a neighborhood where kids often played in the streets. People remember Bryan as an introverted child who played Little League but was afraid of the ball, and he was intimidated by his unpredictable mother. In 1983, at age 10, Miller flew to Phoenix to stay with his aunt and grandparents, believing it was summer vacation, and he soon found out that this was a permanent move. When Ellen arrived in Phoenix, Miller noted that the abuse, which had started in Hawaii, worsened. Witnesses describe emotional, physical, and possibly sexual abuse. A forensic psychologist suggested that Ellen exposed her son to inappropriate behaviors, leading to a distorted view of sexuality mixed with violence. Neighbors observed troubling interactions between them, and Ellen's cousin, Gail Wood, recalled Bryan as being withdrawn as he dealt with his mom's erratic behavior. Cousin Gail recollected, so one day, teenager Bryan Miller came home from school, finding Ellen furious over missing cookies. Now, her fury wasn't that he had eaten them. She accused him of taking them to school to trade for sex. A very twisted leap to make, and it threw Gail for a loop. Well, Bryan denied it, ultimately curling into a ball and hitting his head against the wall. Ellen then threatened to have him sent to an institution as he sobbed, quote, "Please, please, please phone. Get them to take me away because I'd rather be anywhere than be here with you," end quote. In school, Bryan Miller attended special ed classes and was diagnosed as having speech and language difficulties, in addition to being emotionally disabled. Around age 11, he began shoplifting and he set his classroom on fire, which you heard about in part 2. At age 15, around Christmas, Bryan was admitted to a mental health facility after running away from home. He then went to an outpatient program at Arizona Youth for Change, where he and his mother were required to attend weekly family therapy sessions with therapist Cynthia Elliott, who remembers Ellen, quote, as angry, vulgar, and disinterested, much of this directed at her son, end quote, as reported by Lane Santee of azcentral.com. And I highly recommend you reading the Santee series on this case. It is posted under my sources on my blog. Paraphrasing now, when Cynthia asked what had made her so angry, Ellen explained that she had a Barbie doll collection displayed on a wall, and her son had taken something sharp, maybe a knife, and cut a vagina into every single doll in her collection. Cynthia Elliott recalls thinking, quote, "This is not something I've read about in any textbook, how to respond to that." She believed that Bryan Miller was more disturbed than the other kids in the program, end quote. Well, I agree 100%. That is really significantly dysfunctional. While at Arizona Youth for Change, Bryan lashed out in anger, throwing a radio, tearing a chalkboard off the wall, and he finally escaped. 2 months later, May 17th, 1989, about 8:15 a.m., now 16-year-old Bryan, he got on a bus to Paradise Valley Mall. Another passenger, blonde Celeste Bentley, age 24, was headed to work at Nervin's department store. Celeste got off the bus at the Paradise Valley Mall, heading across the parking lot to work her shift. It was a bright, sunny day, and the days were beginning to warm up. A teenage boy was walking behind her some distance away. He had gotten on the bus when she boarded and disembarked with her too. All of a sudden, a brutal blow struck her back. Someone flew by her fast, that boy on the bus. In her shock, Celeste thought he had punched her, but when she reached around to her shoulder, she felt something wet and her hand was red with blood. She screamed. Celeste Bentley's co-workers would call the police and for an ambulance. Help arrived and Celeste was treated for the stab wound. As she sat in the ambulance, the police brought over a teenage boy who she recognized as her attacker, Bryan Patrick Miller. At the hospital, Celeste received a tetanus shot and stitches. Now, over the years, Miller's motivation for the attack varied. He claimed he was curious. He said that Celeste resembled his mother and that he wasn't actually in control of his body, but he also admitted to attempting to kill her. Bryan was then sent to a juvenile detention facility for a number of years. When he was turning 18 and up for parole, Ellen gave the letter of his fantasy plan to kidnap, rape, and murder to the police. Concerned about her safety, Ellen refused to have him back in her home, and as a result, Bryan was taken in by the Paradise Valley Mennonite Church who aimed to rehabilitate him. He lived at the church rent-free and was baptized in May 1992. During his time there, he volunteered and received counseling from a pastor on personal hygiene and basic life skills. Later that year, Miller began working at St. Vincent de Paul, where he met co-worker Randy McClade, who would become his best friend. By the end of the summer 1993, Bryan and Randy were roommates, living at Randy's place. They spent their time working and hanging out, going to concerts, and attending church, where Randy served as a musician. Bryan was known to ride his mountain bike along the Arizona Canal quite often, although later he would deny doing so. In September 1993, Randy came across a news story about a teenage girl who had been murdered while cycling along the canal near Metro Center, which was just west of where they lived. And Randy joked, quote, "Hey, weren't you riding the canal last night?" I was riding on the east side," end quote, Bryan replied. But then Randy would see a picture of a turquoise bodysuit in the Arizona Republic paper, which jarred his memory. He had seen that bodysuit and Bryan's things at their place. Concerned, Randy made mention of this to someone who called in a tip to police in 1994, where Troy found it in his files in 2015. Interviewing everyone who had some connection with Bryan Patrick Miller began. Ex-wife Amy. Amy spoke with Clark and shared a wealth of information about her former husband. Amy said that Bryan took her to Castles and Coasters amusement park for their first date. She was Bryan's first girlfriend, and he was her first kiss, describing him as quiet, polite, and lazy in their early courtship. He accompanied her to church, which was important to Amy, but he also pressured her to consummate their relationship. When her grandmother found out, Amy was kicked out of the house, leading to a quick marriage after less than a year of dating. Now, do you recall that Melanie's body was found near Castles and Coasters? Was Bryan thinking about the murder on that first date with Amy? She revealed that Bryan had confided in her about his mother being very difficult and abusive. When Bryan was 10 years old, his mother had even threatened to cut off his penis because he had been playing with her makeup. So the couple moved in 1998 to Everett, Washington, where they lived with his mother Ellen and her cousins. Bryan told Amy that his mother was difficult to deal with, but when they were together, they acted lovingly, as if they adored each other. Ellen had promised to help her son find a good job, but that never happened. And with money being tight, Amy found herself pregnant. They moved into a small apartment where their financial troubles worsened. Then in 2002, Bryan Miller was arrested and accused of stabbing another woman, and this time he was denied bail. Amy had known about his previous time in juvenile detention for minor infractions, but now she discovered the truth, that it was for attempted murder, and he was facing serious charges once again. While Bryan was in jail, he wrote explicit letters to Amy, who was struggling to provide for their toddler on her own. In these letters, he described acts of sexual sadism he wanted to perform on her, including sticking pins into her breasts and genitals. 8 months later, the trial turned into a he said, she said. Bryan claimed that a prostitute came into his job after hours, wanting to use the phone, and Bryan agreed. After he'd let her into his workplace, she pulled a knife on him. Her version. Melissa Ruiz Ramirez said a guy picked her up and took her to his work after hours to be alone together. She said she had to use the phone and picked it up as he blitz attacked her, stabbing her in the back. Unable to fight back, she ran to a neighbor's to call the police, and this was entirely unprovoked. So in this case, Bryan was sloppy, acting on impulse. Remember, pathology trumps intellect. The opportunity presented itself, and his desire to kill overrode his concern about risks. Now, at the trial, the defense attorney painted Ruiz Ramirez as a drug addict, sex worker, and entirely unreliable. And the prosecution could not use the Paradise Mall attack against Bryan, and as a result, the jury was unable to determine who was telling the truth and acquitted Miller, who was released. Home with Amy and their daughter, he began delving into bondage and sadomasochism during sex. A reluctant Amy went along with it. Later, she became too fearful to resist. Bryan had tied Amy up, holding her with a knife to her throat. He showed her photos and videos on his computer of men killing women, cutting their throats, boiling body parts, and cannibalizing them. And he preferred just developing girls around 14 years old. Well, now they moved back to Phoenix, and they would divorce in 2006. Co-parenting, Bryan Miller won full custody. While working a variety of jobs, Miller embraced cosplay, Renaissance fairs, and steampunk, all while raising his daughter. And in 2010, his mother, Martha Ellen James Miller, died, with Bryan by her side. Amy also revealed secrets that Bryan had shared. When he was living in the Mennonite church apartment, a Girl Scout had come to the door with her parents to sell cookies, and Bryan declined to buy any. However, this special needs girl made an error coming by his apartment again to drop off cookies. Alone this time, Bryan pulled her inside, slit her throat, put her in the bathtub, and chopped her into little pieces. He then threw the little girl in the trash, worried that the decomposition stench would attract attention. Amy had kept this secret until interviewed with Clark, who unfortunately recognized that many details she provided matched the missing person case of 13-year-old Brandy Lynn Myers. The girl had gone missing on May 26, 1992, 6 months prior to Angela's murder. Why hadn't Amy turned Bryan in? Well, she was afraid she didn't have enough information, and she was just scared. He had manipulated her into believing he was religious. He was a pathological liar. When he had gotten out of jail in Washington State, everything changed. He claimed he had hired prostitutes before meeting her and often biked up and down the canal where they lived in Phoenix near the murder scenes. He just scared her. And he had attacked someone else in 2002, but he hadn't gotten caught, or so he claimed. On a trail near their apartment, a young girl was walking to school, and he attacked her with a knife. She was injured, but she got away alive. The police had come to believe that her attacker had arms with sleeves of tattoos for some reason, because Bryan did not have sleeves of tattoos. But he also cut his hair and shaved right after the attack to disguise himself. Oh my God. Next was interviewing 15-year-old Sarah, the suspect's daughter. Marianne was an experienced forensic interviewer and really good with interviewing children, and so she spoke with Sarah. She reported that she got along well with both of her parents, but lived with her dad. She reported no physical, mental, or sexual abuse, noting he only yelled when he got upset. She had liked her dad's ex-girlfriend, Serafina, and his best friend, Randy. Her dad enjoyed watching movies, using his computer, participating in CRIMECON conventions and zombie walks, and working on his car. And although Sarah was a good student, she had few friends and preferred the company of older people. Randy McClade, the best friend. He was interviewed by Marianne and William. An introvert, it was difficult to get Randy to open up and speak plainly. He had met Bryan at St. Vincent de Paul's, where he often gave Bryan rides to work, and then they became roommates after Angela's murder. Randy noticed a few strange things about Bryan, including female panties that he brought home from work, and the disappearance of a butcher knife and tote bag that Bryan used. Around the time of Melanie's murder, Randy found a turquoise bodysuit in Bryan's belongings, and despite his suspicions, Randy was afraid to confront Bryan. He just didn't have enough evidence, and he couldn't believe that Bryan had killed Angela and Melanie. That just didn't seem right. Although it did seem that Bryan had some control over Randy, often using Randy's money. Bryan is a manipulator and always playing victim. Exhausted, Troy realized that the arrest had set off a chain of events that would delay sleep for weeks. His wife, Karen, was thrilled that a suspect was in custody and had known all along that Troy would solve the Canal murders. She understood his dedication, having supported him through the 42 months of obsession and frustration. Karen's mantra, keep going, and reminding him of the women and families impacted by the investigation. This motivation ultimately led to solving the case and making a difference. Hearing his little one cry, he rushed to cuddle the tiny baby, grateful for the goodness that she had brought into his life. Troy called Richard Walter, his Vidoc advisor, who had been right all along. The guy was in their files. Richard told him, quote, "Many lesser-minded people think that it's all over with the arrest, but that's only the tip of the iceberg on such serial AEs, the anger excitation killers. Best of luck," he cackled, end quote. And Richard wasn't surprised to hear that Bryan had experimented on his wife. Next, Troy called Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the forensic genealogist, who was over the moon. Although familial DNA had been used before, no one had previously utilized forensic genealogy to help identify a serial killer. This breakthrough in the Canal murders killer case occurred 4 years before the 2018 case of the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo. And the truth was, Clark Schwarzkopf and Troy were working their files, A to L and Z to M, and would have eventually gotten to letter M for Miller, but Colleen's tip regarding the surname significantly expedited their pursuit of this serial killer. Reading through Bryan Miller's juvenile file, Troy noted his high intelligence, just as Richard Walter had predicted, both smart and crazy. Bryan had a history of running away and exhibited violent tendencies. 4 months before Celeste Bentley was stabbed at the mall, the juvenile authorities had drafted a treatment plan focusing on how Bryan managed his emotions with elaborate fantasies and escapism. He was described as, quote, angry, frustrated, depressed, emotionally immature, and destructive, end quote. Additionally, Troy saw that the juvenile Bryan had sexual problems, with a court judge recommending Bryan to be considered for the sex offender program. A cartoon of an evil-looking duck holding a knife dripping blood was in the file. I believe that this is a self-portrait. Bryan had also attempted to shoplift a DVD of the New York Ripper film about a man who goes about brutally slashing women while quacking like a duck when he killed them, taunting the police. Was art imitating reality? Now, earlier I mentioned that Bryan Miller was a hoarder, living in a place filled with garbage, old magazines, and cockroaches. Half-empty McDonald's cartons and moldy food contributed to the terrible stench. Yet the most shocking part of it, for Troy, was the refrigerator. I have a photo of this kitchen on my blog, and the refrigerator in particular. So imagine a ghastly, cartoonish head lying on its side in the freezer, frozen, eyes rolled back, mouth open, with ice shards hanging from it. It's absolutely appalling, thinking of Bryan's young daughter living in this gross house with that drawing on the refrigerator. And there's more there as well. Troy and I believe that this was confirmation that Bryan had kept Angela's head in the freezer after her murder. For 20 years, he had walked into his kitchen, admiring his own handiwork and relishing the fantasy of his murders, while displaying it in plain sight. Another sarcastic ruse. Finding Clark, Troy wished he had a gas mask to help withstand the stench of the rotting food and mouse feces wafting from the hoarder house. They discovered Dom and JJ, who looked various shades of green, disheartened by the monumental task ahead. Yeah, they've got to go through all of this, moldy food box after moldy food box. As they slowly sifted through the filth, section by section, they had rented 2 massive moving pods to collect any evidence that they might find. Eager to escape the squalid mess, Troy could not believe that anyone actually lived there. The investigation of the Miller house took less than a week, resulting in the seizure of over 6,000 pieces of evidence, which were organized into 761 packages. They sought the bikes and the Walkman, but those items were not found. But among the evidence collected were his mother's diary from May 1982 to May 1983, a plastic doll labeled Visible Woman, which allowed for the dissection of the doll's organs, a Post-it note with a drawing titled Murder Scene, a photo of a zombie cutting off a woman's breast, a book about Jack the Ripper, and a middle school disciplinary note for Bryan. Yeah, this stuff is pretty disturbing. I also shared a photo of the Invisible Woman doll on my blog. So, hoarding. Why do people hoard? Briefly, hoarding is a complex psychological disorder influenced by genetics, neurobiology, and personality traits like perfectionism, in addition to factors such as loss and trauma. This leads to difficulty discarding items that hold emotional significance and provide comfort. As the connections to items grow, the collection expands. Hoarding is often linked to anxiety, depression, and ADHD, becoming more apparent in adulthood. Now, after his mother Ellen's death in 2010, Bryan told many people that the items he had belonged to her. He was emotionally tied to them, feeling that discarding them would mean losing her all over again. The abusive nature of their relationship has only heightened the significance for him. So to throw these things out, he would be throwing her out. He hasn't gotten over his mommy issues. As Troy entered the crime lab, he spotted the zombie hunter car, Bryan's prized possession. Luminol had been applied but failed to react, a letdown. Items were taken from the trunk, which included handcuffs, brass knuckles, a fake blood-stained towel, and a zombie mannequin, all props for Bryan's fantasy. Later, Troy and Clark would meet with Kelly to determine what evidence would be tested in the lab, including blades, brown hair that was found, and 3 teeth. I have no idea, but there were 3 teeth. But ultimately, no DNA connected to the victims was found. Troy went back and reread the FBI profiles on the Canal Killer. Quote, "Fantasies become more elaborate after both murders. Killer would not stop," end quote. Pausing, Troy had to wonder, who else had Bryan killed? And the research began. So in May 26, 1992, that was the day I said that 13-year-old Brandy Myers disappeared. Stu was the missing persons detective on this case. Passionate, they thought of Stu as a virtual bloodhound. Brandy was a beautiful young girl with straight blonde hair and big blue eyes. Her younger sister was very protective of her as Brandy was bullied. Reviewing the files, Stu noted that the police investigation was focused on a missing child, not a child abduction, and as a result, the neighborhood was never canvassed. The parents had been ruled out, with other leads popping up periodically over the years. With no body ever found, the Myers case was difficult. Even with Amy Miller's assertion that Bryan had confessed that he'd killed the little girl, there was just no other solid evidence. Stu and Troy interviewed Bryan about Brandy, with Bryan playing games with them. A month after they searched Bryan's home, another warrant was issued, but yielded nothing. And unfortunately, there just wasn't enough evidence for a conviction, so the Myers case was dropped, and Stu and the team were terribly upset about this development. Troy also learned that on May 28, 1992, 2 days after Brandy Myers disappeared, Shannon Almach was murdered. A decomposing body was found between a dirt roadway and the Central AZ Project Canal, called in by an anonymous person who said they saw the body while riding an ATM in the desert. The only thing was that you couldn't see a body from that location. DNA testing, it yielded nothing. Another case, April 17, 1993. Someone with a club attacked Valerie Brown as she jogged along the canal. After Bryan Miller was arrested, Valerie telephoned, identifying him as her attacker. But was there enough evidence to charge him in Valerie's case? On October 9, 2000, in Washington state, Victoria Mickelson was assaulted with a knife by the Interurban Trail in Everett, where Bryan lived very close to the scene. Following up, Troy learned Victoria Mickelson was still alive, and she explained that she was walking when suddenly a man was on her, stabbing her in the back. Fighting back, she managed to get the knife with the man fleeing, and the description of her assailant closely matched Bryan Miller, with Troy convinced he was good for it, and likely many others. But unfortunately, Washington state purges its files periodically, unlike Arizona, who archived everything. So the Mickelson case, unfortunately, was a dead end. May 23, 2002. Bryan was arrested and held at the Snohomish County Correction Facility for stabbing Melissa Ruiz Ramirez, whom we've heard about. Sadly, she died of a drug overdose in 2007, and Bryan had gotten away with that one, which would have fueled his own beliefs in his intellectual prowess. Now, there were a number of other possible cases affirming the belief that Angela was not Bryan's first. But could they find evidence to link these cases to Bryan Patrick Miller? Only time would tell. Meanwhile, they needed to ensure that Bryan would be convicted for the Canal murders. With the Meyer case dropped, Stu and Troy were highly motivated. They would spend the next year overturning every rock that had passed by Bryan Patrick Miller. Literally, quote, thousands of hours interviewing countless people who had interacted with Bryan since his adolescent years, end quote. Everyone said that he was a loner, unkept with poor hygiene and body odor, but not someone who could be violent. He had deceived his coworkers, steampunk associates, Comic-Con gamer geeks, zombie hunting people, Ren Fair cosplayers, hiding in plain sight. The data retrieved from Bryan's cell phone and hard drives was ready, with Troy, Marianne, and William taking a drive to the Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center, a remote, secure facility. Yeah, you think? A huge warehouse structure held rows and rows and rows of pristine tables with massive computers and monitors. Meeting their forensic investigator, Bryan had stored thousands of images, many violent pornography of women getting stabbed, cut open, beheaded, arms and legs cut off, tortured, and even cooked. It was a horrendous collection of eviscerated women. But what else did they find? Could he have recorded the murders? No such luck. His DV collection consisted of more violent porn, plus TV and films. Some of the titles were Dr. Jekyll and Mistress Hyde, Just Over 18, Buried Alive, All You Can Eat. Many had decapitation scenes, and some poor cop had to sit down and watch them all. Bryan's ex-girlfriends were interviewed, providing some insight. Tura. She met Bryan in February or March of 2012 at a steampunk group dinner. They began dating in May, and she had lived with Bryan, hoarder house and all. Their relationship lasted 5 months. He said he had inherited a lot of stuff from his mother, like an extensive collection of hair barrettes and accessories. Did some of these come from his victims? Bryan liked to collect posters, memorabilia, dolls, video games, and movies, and his favorite featured zombies. He watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Doctor Who, and Star Trek. Tura said that his relationship with his mother was difficult. She had been overbearing and overprotective, and this was why Bryan had so few friends. Yeah, it definitely wasn't the body odor. I'm sure it was just that. He would cry, saying she was physically and emotionally abusive, but still he was with her when she died in 2010. Tura could not believe that Bryan could be violent towards someone, but he was very controlling, having rules about how to cook and navigate the house. Break a rule, and he'd give her the silent treatment. He told her that when he was younger, he had rages where he blacked out and couldn't remember what happened. Troy took note of this. He was laying a groundwork for his defense. Tura also thought he might have bipolar disorder, but Bryan refused to see a doctor. And he valued 2 things, his daughter and his car. However, he put his needs before his daughter's, leaving her to mimic his wants, his needs, his interests. While living with Bryan, Tura said they only had sex a few times, and there were no fetishes or no violence. Oh, and he was obsessed by ducks, and his lucky number was 13. Marianne and William then interviewed 2 other ex-girlfriends. Serafina was his first girlfriend after his ex-wife Amy, around 2006 to 2008. They met working at the Arizona Renaissance Festival. Bryan was awkward and nervous at first, and Serafina wouldn't date him until after his divorce was final. He told her his wife had cheated on him and his heart was broken. He had wanted to work it out, but she had walked out, and Serafina felt terrible for him. Understand, he is playing the victim to the hilt. In the beginning, he was nice, polite, and romantic, and she also said his house was not as bad back then. Serafina really cared for his daughter, and they had a very good relationship, which caused problems with Bryan. He wanted her undivided attention. If she left or went out, he got upset. If she wasn't paying attention to him, he'd sulk. He had a temper and he could get angry easily, and he'd throw things and punch the wall, pout, and cry. Serafina wouldn't have sex until she was married, and this caused problems for them as well. They'd fool around and do other things, and sometimes he would grab her around the neck and squeeze, and she just moved his hand away. But this was more passionate than aggressive. He also told her that his ex-wife was kinky into wild, violent sex. Troy blinked. He blamed Amy? Amy was into sticking pins into her private parts? Well, what about the Paradise Mall stabbing? Bryan had said the woman looked like his mother, who had been deemed unfit to raise him, leading to his time in juvenile corrections. Untrue. Serafina shared a story from Bryan's time living in Washington. A woman had entered his workplace with a knife attempting to rob him, and he defended himself, but no one believed him, and he spent a long time in jail until the police figured it out. Bryan is always the victim, always. What's really sad is that I believe that Bryan became the monster he is because he was a victim. He was a defenseless child, always walking around on eggshells around a volatile mother, always fearful of what could happen. And as a widow, Ellen was the lone parent. So I read a research paper by Morano, Reed, Yaksic, and Keatley called A Behavior Sequence Analysis of Serial Killers' Lives from Childhood Abuse to Methods of Murder. I'm going to be brief, but I'm going to quote a little bit. On average, 50% of serial killers suggest that they have experienced psychological abuse. 36% have experienced physical abuse, and 26% have experienced sexual abuse. And then often, these are all going on simultaneously. And research has shown that there's a very strong link between early childhood abuse and individuals who kill for sexual gratification. More about this later. Serafina learned from Bryan his mother never wanted him and never allowed him to cry, believing real men don't cry. She would hit his head against a wall and threaten him with a knife. He told Serafina that knives made him uncomfortable. Well, why had he and Serafina broken up? He wanted to live together and get married, but Serafina wasn't sure. She felt they just had too many issues despite his constant proposals. He begged her not to leave, but eventually she moved out. His arrest had surprised her. See, I don't believe she had ever known the real Bryan Patrick Miller. She only met the victimized persona he presented. Troy came home from work feeling drained and saw that both the baby and Karen were asleep. He sat down and listened to an interview with Marilyn, another former girlfriend of Bryan's, who had met him at an Arizona Steampunk Society event in 2011. They started dating in January 2012. Marilyn, 10 years older than Bryan, said their first date was at a shooting range with his daughter. When visiting his hoarder home, which he called the duck pond, he had had to clear off a spot on the sofa for her to sit. One time, they were supposed to go to a birthday party, but Bryan's cat, Lucifer, got out. Marilyn wanted to go look for her, but Bryan insisted they had to go to the party. Later, he told her the cat had been hit by a car and was dead. Marilyn now wanted to go get Lucifer and bury her properly, but Bryan refused, choosing to go to the party alone, and eventually broke up with her. Then Bryan vindictively had Marilyn banned from steampunk activities and a local book club. Despite this, Marilyn described him as a quiet gentleman who was never violent. Their sex life was vanilla, with Bryan struggling to ejaculate. He had shared that his ex-wife had cheated on him and that he faced abuse from his mother, leading to juvenile detention. He had also broken up with Serafina. Bryan was passionate about cars, especially his quirky zombie hunter car, and enjoyed riding his bike, though he hadn't done so for a while. And no, he had never mentioned any blackouts. So what they realized is that the girlfriend's stories about Bryan were consistent. He regularly painted a skewed, manipulative version of his history where he had been victimized his whole life. Okay, it is now October 2022. The modern courtroom was equipped with large screen TVs, and it was set for the bench trial of Bryan Patrick Miller, presided over by no-nonsense Judge Suzanne Cohen. She had previously prosecuted the baseline killer, Mark Groddeau, who received 9 death sentences. For more details, check out my blog, www.murdershelfbookclub.com, December 2025, which has photos and articles related to this case of the baseline killer. In the 7 years since the January 2015 arrest, the defense had filed numerous motions causing delay upon delay. In January 2022, Linda Brosso and Marlene Bernas, the mothers of Angela and Melanie, asserted their right to a speedy trial and sued, and the situation worsened with the COVID-19 lockdowns. Bryan underwent multiple psychiatric evaluations as they planned to plead not guilty, and the families were left to wait and wait and wait for justice for Angela and Melanie. The state was led by experienced prosecutor Vince Imbardino, tall, lean, with a soft Southern accent, who instilled fear in defense attorneys. His skilled co-counsel was Elizabeth Reamer, a balanced pairing. A pretrial ruling prevented the prosecution from presenting anything about the Brandy Meyer case. Bryan's involvement in it was unproven, and it would be prejudicial to the hearings. The defense team was led by R.J. Parker and Denise Dees, an equally formidable pairing. R.J.'s eloquence and friendliness complemented Denise's strengths. But by 2021, the defense faced a harsh reality. The defendant's DNA was on the victims. So instead of claiming innocence, they shifted their focus to an insanity defense, arguing that Bryan did not understand that his actions were wrong. The prosecution would present Bryan Patrick Miller as a sexual sadist who craved sexual assault and murder and mutilation. Contrary to the defense's claim that Bryan was insane at the time of the murders, they presented him as having some psychological difficulties, but insanity was not one of them. The plan, that letter that he'd written back in juvenile detention, turned in by his mother, spoke to the length of time he had been planning these crimes. Angela's murder had followed his blueprint fairly closely. It took the state about 4 weeks to complete its presentation of the case to the judge. William and Clark testified about their roles in the investigation, as did some of the original crime scene detectives. Linda Brosso, Angela's mother, and her fiancé, Joe Krakowicki, testified, as did Melanie Bernas's mother. The prosecution's forensic pathologist explained that the firm found at both crime scenes matched Bryan Patrick Miller's DNA perfectly, and ex-wife Amy testified to Bryan's violent acts in their bedroom. The medical examiner's testimony was raw and horrific. Miller's attack on Brosso was extreme. The initial fatal stab wound was so fierce, it sliced her heart's aorta, her lung, and fractured a rib. There were too many stab wounds to calculate exactly how many, and then he'd nearly cut her in half. The medical examiner testified, adding, quote, "The first incision ran from her upper chest to just above her pubic bone. A circumferential incision wrapped around her body. There were wounds on her chest where the skin was pulled back, as well as injuries to her left breast. 11 days later, her head was found caught on a grate in the canal, and it suffered little decomposition," end quote. 10 months later, the second victim suffered a deep stab wound to her back. Just like Brosso, the fatal knife plunge severed her aorta, piercing her lung. A cross was carved into her chest, along with the initials WSC. The meaning of those initials was never determined. While I suggested to Troy that it could be wizard, sorcerer, and cleric, classes of characters played in a number of nerdy fantasy games with powers that could defeat the undead. The judge would know that these attacks that snuffed out the lives of 2 women were brutal and devastating. Then it was time for R.J. Parker and Denise Dees to present the defense, which would last months upon months. Bryan Patrick Miller claimed he could not remember killing these women, that he had blacked out doing this, exactly as Troy had predicted. He suffered from a number of psychological disorders, including autism, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Clinical psychologist Dr. Bethany Brand had met with Bryan a number of times, and she shared Bryan's description of his mind and the noise within. Quote, He felt like different TVs are playing in his head, end quote. A report by AZ Family's Brianna Whitney, Dr. Brand said that Miller suffered from dissociative amnesia. This is a mental health condition where a person loses significant personal memories, typically after a severe stress or trauma. A sufferer experiences gaps in their autobiographical information, like your background and life events. Triggers include abuse, war, accidents, or the death of loved ones. Internal conflicts, such as extreme guilt or unresolved interpersonal issues, can also be factors that trigger dissociative amnesia. Now, there are 4 types of dissociative amnesia. Local amnesia, which is the most common, involves a complete failure to recall events within a specific circumscribed period. For example, immediately following a car accident, you can't remember what happened. There is selective amnesia. The person can recall some, but not all of the events or details within a specific period of time. Generalized amnesia is a rare, extensive loss of memory encompassing one's entire life history and identity. And systematized amnesia, memory loss related to a specific category of information, such as all memories related to a person or a location. All right, clearly the type the defense is claiming is localized amnesia, a total failure to recall the murders. This is possible. However, we also know that Bryan Patrick Miller is smart and manipulative. The defense argued that his psychological disorders, combined with localized amnesia, made him legally insane at the time of the crimes. Bryan Miller did not know that killing them was wrong. The defense asked Dr. Brand if dissociative amnesia could cause someone to kill, and Dr. Brand said, quote, "Something like it could be related, but not causal. There could be a part of them, a self state, that has very violent, revengeful feelings, fantasies, and wishes. And another part not know about that. In that case, it could contribute, but in other cases, there's plenty of dissociative amnesia patients out there that don't commit murders," end quote. Dr. Brand observed that Miller presented an avoidance pattern. He did not want to have a dissociative disorder, and he didn't seem aware of the symptoms causing him to become frustrated. For example, Dr. Brand asked him how his semen was found inside the murdered women. Quote, "He became incredibly frustrated with me pushing this. He didn't become hostile, he didn't become irate, but he was very frustrated. To not remember doing something so egregious as murder, that's incredibly dysfunctional," end quote. If you believe he actually had amnesia, however, I do not, because he had the drawing of a frozen head in his freezer on his refrigerator for 20 years. He remembers, there's no doubt in my mind. He knows that Angela's head was there, and he looked at it every day of his life, loving it. Dr. Mark Cunningham testified to the abuse Bryan suffered at the hands of his mother, and that he was forced at a very young age to watch pornography, and his mother acted out sexually in front of him. This contributed to Bryan's traumatic self, and his other normal self, where he was a loving father, good friend, and a colleague. Quote, "If Ellen had set out when Bryan was an infant to create someone who was going to commit sexual homicide, she left no square unchecked," said Cunningham, end quote. The prosecution would counter these experts with Dr. James Seward, a well-respected forensic psychologist and neuropsychologist. He refuted what Judge Cohen had heard, affirming that Bryan knew exactly what he was doing, that he was a sexual sadist who enjoyed reliving the murders in his fantasy life. During the close, prosecutor Vince Imbordino refocused on the victims, Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas, the actual victims who had had their lives stolen. April 2023. It was time for Judge Cohen to render her verdict as the elite cold case team nervously waited. DNA didn't lie, but the defense had tried to muddy the waters, seeking a sympathetic ear from the bench. And Judge Suzanne Cohen read her verdict. She found Bryan Patrick Miller guilty on all 6 counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault of both victims. The sentencing phase would now decide if Miller faced life in prison or the death penalty. Witnesses described Bryan as a shy little boy and a loving, devoted father, arguing for his life to be spared given the childhood trauma he had suffered. Victim impact statements were then read to the court by the families of the victims. Linda Brosso, Angela's mother, said, quote, "No, it does not get any better with time. I keep waiting to wake up from this horrible dream. The defendant stole my angel from the earth. Angela was my one and only. I will never be able to plan her wedding. I will never have grandchildren. The defendant stole her future, her innocence, her life. The defendant took my reason to live, my reason to laugh, my reason to love. With his actions on that night, he murdered my angel. He ripped my heart, and I will never, ever be the same." End quote. Whew. Okay. Melanie's older sister, Jill, spoke about missing Melanie. Quote, "Words cannot begin to explain the level of excruciating pain we experience every single day since her murder. We live without her smile, her hugs, her companionship. We live without her love. The absence we feel in our lives never goes away. Singing happy birthday to an empty chair each year and repeating the same Melanie stories over and over to our kids and grandkids, because that's all we have. That's all they will ever know of their Aunt Mel." End quote. And Jill added that the monster had exhibited no remorse and offered no apology. Quote, "How many hours of our lives have been taken away with the distraction, anxiety, anger, sadness, and loneliness from the defendant dragging us into this and through his dark world. It is incomprehensible and immeasurable." End quote. Then Bryan Patrick Miller spoke, and I'm not quoting all of him. Quote, "I am not looking for sympathy today. This time is for the family and the friends of the victims. I cannot imagine what they have endured all these years. I accept the court's decision, and I'm hoping this trial and my convictions have provided some measure of relief for the families. While I cannot change the past, I can work to have a positive impact on others in the future." End quote. June 7th, 2023. It had been 8 long months. Judge Cohen read a 26-page decision to a tense courtroom holding its breath. She pointed out Bryan's age of 19 and 20 at the time of the murders, of being emotionally and sexually abused by his mother, and that right up to his arrest, he was viewing violent pornography, indicating that he became aroused by violent acts. This evidence proved premeditation, not insanity, and Bryan Patrick Miller was aware of right and wrong. Therefore, she sentenced Bryan Patrick Miller to death twice and an additional 24 years behind bars. County Attorney Rachel Mitchell would speak to the press. Quote, "What happened to Melanie and Angela were horrific crimes, and it has taken decades of rigorous work by the Phoenix Police Department and the Phoenix Crime Lab to achieve justice, and I commend the detectives, officers, and civilian personnel. Likewise, I give my thanks to the prosecutors and the staff of my office who worked relentlessly to bring a measure of peace to the families of these 2 young women." End quote. Relief. He would never hurt an innocent person again. Yet the questions Troy had written down on the legal pad years before remained unanswered. So many whys. Quote, I hope that someday Bryan will reach out to me and give me a tell-all interview. Bundy did, right? And so did Dahmer. Maybe Bryan will follow suit. End quote. Of learning of Miller's conviction, original Phoenix homicide investigator, long retired Leo Spiliopoulos spoke to PennLive.com about his thoughts going to the families of Angela and Melanie. Quote, I think they're finally feeling that some kind of justice was done after waiting 30 years for this to play out. This is justice being done. There's never a better description of it than in this case. It should give people some comfort that all is not lost, that you have to have some faith. Maybe they'll find a little peace. End quote. "18 months after Bryan Miller was arrested, Troy's new baby suffered from colic, and his 2-year-old was fully mobile and exploring the world. Karen had snuck away for some well-needed sleep. Distracted, Troy had heard of rumors of detective and sergeant cuts in the department that they needed to shore up patrol vacancies. But no, he told himself, there is no way logic would allow the brass to cut the cold case team, who had solved 12 to 15 cold cases a year, cases dating back to the 70s. They just hunted down a serial killer. They won the International Association of Chiefs of Police Award for Excellence in Criminal Investigation and the Chiefs Unit Award. And they were doing significant work. And then the phone rang. A commander who was retiring in 2 weeks abruptly told Troy that he was going back to patrol. Dizzy, disbelief mingled with sharp disappointment. How could they do this? They were turning their backs on cold case victims and their families. Didn't anyone care? Well, that was the catalyst for Troy beginning to write this book, feeling the need to tell this story, how this elite, amazing team of investigators came together and kept going time after time. Cold case teams are important, even if it takes years to get results, and the answers aren't always what we want, as in the case of Brandy Myers. Well, in May 2020, Troy returned to the new cold case homicide team as it was restored, to regain and to begin anew. Again, Troy put together an amazing unit, doing incredibly important and frustrating work, and then he retired. He hopes that this book honors the victims, Angela Brosso and Melanie Bernas. Troy also pays homage to the original investigators who diligently worked the case, maintaining excellent records and files, and without this organization, the perpetrator might still be hidden in the shadows. I sincerely hope that you will read Chasing Down the Zombie Hunter, the true story of a small-town accountant, an elite group of detectives, and Arizona's most terrifying cold case, and be swept along as even more details emerge. You will appreciate what a dedicated, highly trained group of cold case detectives can accomplish with a well-funded DNA lab. I briefly want to mention a research study that I read that notes the connection between types of child abuse and subsequent lust killer behavior later in life, per evidence from the crime scenes. This particular study on serial killer lives investigates physical, sexual, and psychological childhood abuse. Physical abuse in childhood leads to a metamorphosis into lust and rape and anger, murder being carried out very quickly, with the victims bound, with evidence of overkill, and discarding the body at the scene. Psychological abuse is characterized later by lust-rape behavior, which leads to overkill, mutilation, dismemberment, and disposal. Sexual abuse similarly evolves into a lust-rape behavior, plus torture, victim binding, which is a power-oriented behavior, mutilation, blindfolding, necrophilia, and even cannibalism. So they're all a little different. Quote, although those who were physically abused were more likely to demonstrate overkill of their victims, the most specifically violent methods of kill were practiced by those who had been sexually or psychologically abused early in life. For example, mutilation, torture, and binding the victim were more typical of serial killers who had experienced sexual abuse. Furthermore, those who had been sexually abused rarely showed evidence of overkill, and the murders tended to be carried out quickly. This was not the case for both physical and psychological abuse, as both showed evidence of overkill. End quote. Based on this data and what we know of Bryan Patrick Miller's behavior, I have to conclude he suffered all three types of abuse growing up. And my heart does go out to that child who was clearly disturbed by age 11 when he set his classroom on fire because he didn't like his grades, and certainly by 16 when he stabbed Celeste Bentley in the back because she looked like his mother. There is a complex diagram on my blog that explains this visually and how they overlap. So check it out. Okay, update. In July 2024, CBS News reported that Bryan Patrick Miller is sitting on death row in a special management unit at the Hillman prison complex in Florence, Arizona. Responding to an email from 48 Hours, Miller wrote about his life on death row. Quote, "It's better than the county jail, but it's obvious that isolation has taken its toll on many people here. It's far from great, as I am even more isolated from those I care about, and also my legal team. The food is still not great, and the cells are getting very cold now that the temps are falling." End quote. He remains bitter about his trial, and he disagrees with his defense attorney's psychological experts. He stated, quote, "I maintain that I did not do the murders," end quote. But his semen in the victims tells me that this is more manipulative bunk. And that's a wrap for episode 149. My interview with Troy A. Hillman is coming next, and we get into some crazy stories that didn't make the book, so subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Now, my next book is Incendiary: The Psychiatrist, the Mad Bomber, and the Invention of Criminal Profiling by Michael Cannell. This is the case that first made me notice criminal profiling, and finding a book to get all of the details was like manna from heaven. What a gift. It is the 1940s, and President Franklin Roosevelt is in the White House. I'll Never Smile Again by Tommy Dorsey and his orchestra, featuring up-and-coming Frank Sinatra, and Glenn Miller's In the Mood were at the top of the song charts that year. And a serial bomber is stalking the streets of New York City. Pausing the bombings while the U.S. was at war, the bomber resumed his deadly obsession, bombing New York City in 1951 as an explosion erupted in Grand Central Terminal, then Radio City Music Hall, and over, maiming victims as he is called the greatest individual menace New York City ever faced. The race to catch him would give birth to a new science called criminal profiling, and capturing a monster would forever change the face of law enforcement. So please join me as we look back into this frightening and pivotal story of the Mad Bomber. Thank you for listening. I see you as you hear me. 2026 is going to be amazing. I will be at the Hamptons Whodunit in April for a weekend of true crime fun with crime fiction authors, with Cheryl McCollum, the founder of the Cold Case Investigative Research Foundation, Wildlife CSI, and host of Zone 7, Joseph Scott Morgan of Body Bags, and so much more. What a weekend. I will see you at CRIMECON 2026 in Las Vegas, May 29th to May 31st. And if you're buying a badge, use my code to save 10%. It is all lowercase letters, one word, murdershelf. If you enjoy the podcast, please share it with family and friends and leave a positive 5-star review wherever you listen. You can join my Patreon for $2 to $4 a month to help choose the next book I feature. And I am teaching my serial killer class We have moved on to case studies now. And don't forget about Wildlife CSI in October at Lake Tobias. Check it out at eventbrite.com. All of my sources, photographs, articles, recipes are on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, December 2025. If you have any questions or comments, contact me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com or follow me on X, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. See you next time, Murder Bookies. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.